My name's Kevin Franklin from Elevate, an LRQA company. Very excited and very happy to be able to join this incredibly important session. And thank you to everyone for inviting us to be part of this process. It's our privilege today to be able to talk through with you what we believe is a new era for business-driven sustainability with a focus on supply chains. As we heard, supply chain sustainability is an increasingly critical part of all day-to-day business activities globally. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues. Firstly, Ding Ding, who is our Director of Product and Analytics, and Ding Ding is based here in Hong Kong together with myself. I'm also joined by Jeff Bond, who is a Senior Director for our advisory team. Jeff's normally based in Hong Kong, but today is actually dialing in from Singapore. So together, we hope to make this a collaborative and engaging session. Please do feel free to place any questions in the chat as we are engaged in this discussion together and looking to make it as interactive as possible. Perhaps just a quick introduction to Elevate before we kind of get into the substance of sustainability and supply chains. For those of you that don't already know Elevate, we are a leader in ESG, sustainability and supply chain specifically. We have over 750 people globally operating in around 100 plus countries. We're very much headquartered in Asia. So our HQ is in Hong Kong, but we have teams across the region in Singapore, China, multiple offices, as well as India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam, and globally moving into Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Ultimately, we work in the supply chains for multinationals and on behalf of multinationals with a focus on apparel, consumer goods, electronics, retail, food and beverage, as well as some of the other sectors that we've noted here. So today, we're really going to talk about some of the risks, issues, and challenges that face these sectors as they look to do responsible businesses or business activity globally. As an organization, we are really structured around four main areas of assessment, which is auditing, and we do over 20,000 on-the-ground assessments at factories, farms, and other facilities in these different sectors globally. We also have an advisory team, as well as a program management team and an analytics team. And today we will share insights from all of these teams as part of this joined up conversation. And ultimately, as part of the joined up mission and vision of Elevate to drive business-driven sustainability thinking. Just to provide a little bit more color around each of these four main areas, I mentioned advisory, assessment, program management, and analytics. Ultimately, our goal is to link all of these as an ecosystem that we can leverage and use on a day-in, day-out basis with our corporate customers and with the supply chain partners, factories and farms and other facilities that we work with every day. The intent through this process is to, in our advisory function, help our corporate clients to understand the risks that they're exposed to as a business by virtue of where they're operating. Based on those risk exposures, to design the appropriate strategies, put in place the appropriate management systems, build programs of work that then engage suppliers deeply to not just understand, but also mitigate ESG and sustainability issues as they manifest in those supply chains globally. This leads to improvements with respect to sustainability, resilience, and also helps to drive business-driven thinking into the sustainability agenda and incentivize suppliers to take sustainability as a key part of their day-to-day business actions. Our assessment team, as I mentioned, covers primarily social compliance assessments. So as I said, we do over 20,000 audits a year. A lot of this is focused on social issues like labor standards, health and safety, business ethics, and equivalence, which we'll talk about as we kind of move through this conversation together. But we do also go deeply into specific topics like building, fire, and electrical safety, as well as, of course, covering environment. All of this is managed by our programs teams, our customer teams, our client services teams, generates data, analytics, and relevant insights that we leverage and use to help fuel continuous improvement in the corporate agenda, in the corporate and boardroom conversations, in corporate KPIs, but also very much on the ground for the suppliers and manufacturers, building a joined up, collaborative, partnership-oriented approach to really dealing with and advancing the sustainability conversation. ultimately we recognize that this means moving people, moving corporations and suppliers slightly away from maybe the traditional old school approach to sourcing, which may have been a one-size-fits-all style model, to much more of a responsible and sustainable sourcing agenda that is an agenda informed by some of the new and emerging regulation, which Jeff will talk us through shortly, but also an agenda that is data-driven, risk-based, incentivizes engagement and action, and that leverages the right tools and the right solutions to drive the right kinds of behaviors into supply chains globally. Of course, all of this needs to be captured and reported through scorecards, metrics, and in sustainability reports, some of which we've recognized before. And I'm sure it's been a recurring theme in many of these different sessions. But ultimately, what we're looking to produce is a management system, cycle, and process that is one that drives collective engagement and reinforces the logic and intent of business-driven sustainability, where sustainability and sustainable actions form part of the day-to-day business process. With that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Jeff, who will talk us through the emerging regulatory framework and how the regulatory framework is helping to change the agenda for business on many of the above sustainability topics. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. I feel like in the last few years, we've heard the term supply chain more than I did in the rest of my life. And that alone is kind of a evidence and reminder of how front and center supply chain ESG risks have been, especially this year. There have been major disruptions to supply chains that have made these risks very real to people. Supply chains have been disrupted, and due to COVID, due to war, and due to other geopolitical events. And while that risk in the past has been perhaps on a smaller scale or theoretical at times, it has been very real this year. Second, as mentioned, governments and regulators are taking action now. Over the last few years, regulations have really been stepping up, both in quantity and in substance. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Civil society continues to play a major role in highlighting the issues that are within our supply chains, particularly with labor issues that are further up supply chains than perhaps many of us are used to looking. On the news and technology side, it's driving a level of transparency that perhaps in the past might have been voluntary, but now what we're seeing is that technology means that secrets don't stay secret for long, and certainly not forever. And that means that issues that perhaps had in the past been hidden in supply chains just will not stay hidden. That risk is going to emerge. On the investment side, we've all seen the popularity of ESG investment just skyrocketing in terms of the amount of the assets under management. Just also I feel that it is it's getting much more attention than perhaps even the dollar amounts communicate. And finally, brands and retailers are taking real and meaningful action. Sometimes it's criticized as greenwashing or sustainability washing or what have you, but many are taking very meaningful and sincere actions. Ding, if you could please go to the next slide. And all of this is being driven by, or it's also, or perhaps it's a bit of a interdependency here, that regulation is driving supply chain due diligence, but also these other factors that we've mentioned are driving increasing regulation. And so, as mentioned, investors are increasingly spending time and resources on due diligencing companies, conducting due diligence on companies to ensure that they are upholding human rights, because they see that there is a real bottom line risk there. Governments we have a few salient recent examples of new legislation coming out of the U.S. for example, but it's not just the U.S. where the requirements have been increasing over the last few years. The UK, France, Australia, Spain, Netherlands, Germany, the EU, Switzerland, many countries are implementing regulations that are raising the standards and raising the stakes for supply chain due diligence. We mentioned here the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act because it has come into effect just this week and is a particularly, I guess, strong example of the trajectory of the regulation and how companies are going to have to raise the bar to respond to that. And then at the same time, this is all, supply chain due diligence is also interrelated with efforts to achieve net zero. A lot of the renewable energy supply chains and other technologies that we're going to depend on for meeting climate goals they have supply chains, and those supply chains will also be subject to these higher standards. And how companies, how entire countries respond to that and manage these complexities it's going to be very important, both for our upholding our social commitments and also meeting these climate goals. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Ding Ding, who can share more about the outlook and some of the trends that we're seeing in the data regarding ESG and supply chains.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. This is Ding Ding. Very nice to be here. As Kevin and Jeff mentioned earlier, that the overall ESG landscape has changed quite a lot. And one thing that sets Elevate apart is the amount of data that we have been collecting over the last 15 years or so. And by data, we mean verified on-the-ground insights. So we're very well positioned to, provide insights into what's going on and help companies to design their programs and strategies, segment their supply chain, prioritize their monitoring and remediation efforts. So today we would like to share a little bit about our geography risk ratings and what the risk exposure looks like for 2022. On this slide, you will see that our geography risk ratings covers 5 different dimensions, including labor, health and safety, environment, business ethics, and management system. We calculate a score on a scale of 0 to 10. With 0 meaning bad and 10 meaning good for each one of those pillars and their associated sub-indices, as well as the total aggregated overall supply chain score. So we have 38 sub-indices for every year. The source of the data covers, number one, of course, our audit data collected on site from the ground by experts in the facilities that they have audited and visited. It is then connected to public domain data from World Bank, OECD, and other agencies to supplement audit data. The third pillar is the Sentinel data, which is a machine learning algorithm to retrieve adverse media to help us have more real-time monitoring of what's going on in the global supply chain. The combination of 3 really provides a very rich data set that allows us to calculate a large fair number of countries. We cover over 100 countries in 2022 and another 90 plus subnational information in countries like China, India, US, and Vietnam. This slide shows the global risk outlook for 2022. We actually calculate this score twice a year. First one beginning of the year and the second one mid of the year. We're actually in the process of updating our geography risk ratings at the very moment. Therefore, this session will primarily cover the scores that we published beginning of 2022. Here's the heat map of the risk exposure. As a reminder, each score is calculated on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 meaning extreme risk, 10 meaning low risk, and they're color-coded from red, orange, yellow to green. On the right hand, you will see the distribution by risk band. In 2022, it covered a lot more countries, 2022 to be precise. And we also see countries that are moving from low to medium or from medium to high countries to risks. We're gonna elaborate a little bit more in the following slide. First, let's take a look at Asia. Asia continues to be high-risk country, high-risk region, especially those in the South Asia and Southeast Asia. They're rated either high or extreme risk for all 5 dimensions. Malaysia experienced the biggest drop in 2022 in its score, and this may not come as a surprise, considering how much attention Malaysia has received in 2021. We're gonna look a little bit more closely into Malaysia in just a minute. Malaysia is followed by Thailand, which has, let me see, which has a 16% drop, and also Taiwan. Both countries, like Malaysia, also use quite a large percentage of foreign migrant workers from neighboring countries. Thailand, as the hub, received a lot of workers from Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and a little bit from Vietnam. Taiwan have workers from Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. Same issues also exist in other countries like Japan or South Korea, even though they might be considered as low risk. All in all, meaning that there are flashpoints of extreme or high risk areas in Asian countries that may represent improvement areas. Let's take a deep dive into Malaysia. Malaysia's score for 2022 is 3.64, representing over 26% drop in its supply chain risk scores. Particularly, the main significant decreasing area includes forced labor index, freedom of associations, humane treatment, transparency, working hours, and emergency evacuation. This is not a surprise, obviously. This is due to a lot more scrutiny and attention that has been paid to Malaysia in 2021, particularly from regulators and activists. On the right hand, you see a screenshot of the number of WROs, withhold release orders issued by the US Customs and Border Protection, in short CBP, in the last 10 years or so. Malaysia is marked as dark green in this graph. In 2020, CBP issued 3 withhold release orders against Malaysia companies, first ever in CBP's history against Malaysia. In 2021, 9 WROs were issued, and 4 of them were against Malaysian companies, covering medical gloves and palm oil industries. And because of those scrutiny and attention, we have already seen quite a lot of progress. For instance, the amount of money that has been paid back to workers. Here we included some headlines of the news that referring to the recruitment fees paid back to workers. We're talking about hundreds of millions here in US dollars. Remember, those are the money that workers have paid in the first place to receive their job in Malaysia. You might be wondering why. Why do workers need to pay so much fees to get their job? This is related to the fact that Malaysia is one of the countries that rely heavily on foreign migrant workers, especially from their neighboring countries. Based on our data, over half of the workforce in Malaysian facilities are foreign migrant workers from Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar, etc. And due to the way that those workers are hired, there are typically multiple layers of labor agents used in both destination and sending countries. For instance, a Malaysian factory may reach out to a local agency based in KL, and that agency may reach out to another agency in Kathmandu, and then that agency may reach out to other brokers in rural areas to gather the workers. So there are multiple layers of agents involved. It's really hard to get transparency, and there will be a fee involved in each one of those layers for workers. And they need to pay additional fees, for instance, for administrative purpose, such as getting their passport, visa, health exam, multiple health exams, and as well as transportation cost. And all of them add up easily to a pretty high amount. For instance, in our data, Bangladesh workers may pay up to $4,000 to get their job in Malaysia. That's a pretty high number for most of us as well, not to mention workers in Bangladesh. They typically need to borrow money to take a loan to pay for their recruitment fees plus interest, which put them in a debted situation. And this is not just about Malaysia. We see this type of issues in nearly all countries like use foreign migrant workers, such as we mentioned before, Thailand, Taiwan, Japan, as well as Middle East like Qatar, and Europe. So something that we will relate back to when we talk about the Ukraine situation in just a minute. In addition to the recruitment fees and issues related to foreign migrant workers, we also see more violations related to humane treatment, such as harassment, discrimination, etc. This, of course, can be related to a number of things: culture difference, language barrier, different ways of working, and lack of goods management system to monitor what's going on the production floor. What's also interesting is in 2021, we see a significant drop in the level of transparency in the audited Malaysian factories as well. Just to explain here, by transparency, we mean the extent to which facilities are able to share with the real records of working hours and wages to provide us the full access to all those documents. And the job in transparency really is an alarming indicator. That's something that we need to work on and to ensure that we know what's the real risks and performance in the facilities. But Malaysia is actually not alone in the transparency performance. We see the drop in other Asian countries as well. For instance, China. We know the transparency has been an issue in China for many years, but COVID actually have made it even worse. We also have seen a decline in countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam, where traditionally transparency was not so much a concern, but now we have seen it has gone down. That requires closer attention and different ways of working. Transparency is actually linked to a number of factors, such as concerns over hours and wages. Obviously COVID played a role here, because of COVID and lockdown and other shifting logistic challenges, all of them have an impact on transparency. And factories' ability to stay compliant. COVID also worsened other factors like, for instance, labor shortage. We see an increasing trend of facilities in China and other Asian countries like Vietnam to hire more temporary workers or use agencies to hire workers or higher hours. All of them have a direct impact on the level of transparency and other compliance risks. Now let's move on to Europe. Europe, we are increasing our audit business in Europe and covering different industries. And it's very interesting to see that while many of the countries in Europe remain to be medium risk countries, but we have seen a decline in their performance, particularly countries like Germany. Germany's score in 2022 is 0.09, which represents an over 20% decline in comparison with the year before. This actually is a surprising result for us, and we also dig deeper and got connected with our local team in Europe. We understand that there are a number of reasons for this. One is increase in both domestic and foreign migrant workers in German supply chain due to labor shortage. The second is the type of facilities that we're covering are different. They may not be traditional manufacturing sites, but service providers like call centers, warehouses, transportation companies, etc. And we see more violations related to forced labor and human treatment as a result. Now, this becomes very relevant given the current situation and tension in the Ukraine crisis. We can foresee that more Ukraine workers will appear in the global supply chain. Just to share, based on our data from 2021, so this is before crisis, there are quite a lot of Ukraine workers in the global supply chain already, 2%, and the common destination countries are other European countries like Poland, Czech, Hungary, etc. So we really need to ask ourselves, are we ready, and what kind of measures we need to take to protect those workers and limit the risks, particularly around forced labor, human treatment, etc. And also, it's important for us to look at the Russia supply chain as well, not just the tier 1, but also more upstream raw material suppliers. For instance, solar is a key sector, but one of the raw material is silicon metal, or can be referred as MGSI, and Russia is one of the key sourcing countries for that material. So this brings up a number of questions that we should be thinking and discussing to make sure that we're in a good position to protect both workers and our supply chain.
That's a great point, Ding Ding. And maybe just to reinforce, for those businesses on the phone, this means reviewing your current supply chain practices and strategies to ensure that if you're sourcing from the above mentioned countries, and in this case, particularly if you're sourcing from Europe and related regions, that you review what you're doing today and make sure it's fit for purpose to now recognize and be responsive to identify sustainability issues or risks that could come as a result of this ongoing crisis in the Ukraine. And it's not just the Ukraine, there are other migrant workers coming in from other countries that may not be in conflict situations, but could be economic migrants or equivalents. So let's make sure that we're looking at supply chains and their design, as well as the programs we have in place from a compliance perspective or a sustainability perspective to flag these issues proactively and respond accordingly. Obviously, for those that are not businesses, but that might be NGOs, civil society actors, academics, and others on the call, then this is definitely something that should be raised, flagged, and taken into ongoing discussions with other key stakeholders to ensure that we're collectively oriented towards ensuring that we proactively identify and address these risks moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. Moving on, in the interest of time, I will speed up a little bit. I know we still have quite a bit of contents to go through. Just quickly on Americas. Americas, some of the key countries remain to be high risks, but there is some good news. Mexico, we've seen quite a significant progress in its compliance performance. And this is very much relevant. The number of violations we see related to forced labor, humane treatment, freedom of association have all gone down quite a bit. And largely this is due to the new trade agreement that has been put in place, which has a much higher emphasis on labor conditions and freedom of association. And consequently, we also see improvements in performance related to health and safety, such as fire safety, emergency evacuations, etc. So this is a very good reminder that things can be better, and the work that we're doing, such as the fees that has been paid back to Malaysian workers and the progress we see in Mexico, can be replicated in other countries. All right, I think that's my last slide. Maybe Jeff, over to you to talk about, what kind of solutions that clients and others can put in place to mitigate the risks.
Sure, thank you. And so we've talked about the emerging regulatory frameworks and how that's driving a real need for action. Ding Ding has talked about a lot of the trends we're seeing around the world that again underscore the need for companies to take action. And now what can companies do? What are the solutions? And what are the solutions that we offer? Before getting into any of the details, I think it should be clear from what we've already shared that it needs to be proactive, and it needs to be a smarter approach than perhaps conventional procurement and supply chain management takes. It needs to anticipate risks. It needs to recognize that supply chains cover multiple geographies, multiple commodities, many tiers and layers, and it needs to look beyond just that first tier. And it also needs to preempt and recognize real-time incidents. It can't be just reactive. And our approach as a result is to look at risk exposure based on both risk levels and leverage over that risk. Looking at it from a risk management systems standpoint and as a holistic system, not just a piecemeal approach. In our experience, that hasn't worked, and it seems that some companies want to kind of dabble here and there when what's really needed is a more complete and comprehensive solution. With the next slide, I'll talk a little about the importance of segmenting a supply chain. Modern supply chains they're so big, they're so complex. It's impossible for a one size fits all approach to managing ESG risk in supply chains. And so by segmenting a supply chain, companies can better prioritize their efforts. And we look at it through two dimensions. There's risk exposure, which is if a supplier is low risk or high risk or extreme risk. And we look at risk leverage, which is the amount of influence that a company might have over the partners in their supply chain. And these two dimensions can help a company prioritize kind of and determine what approach to take to their suppliers. The different inputs that we use to ensure that this is a systematic and evidence-driven model. For risk exposure, we use inputs from civil society, supply chain data, product level data, information and engagement with workers themselves. We have a tool called Sentinel that pulls publicly available information from media sources and beyond. And all of those can be combined to provide an overall picture of the level of risk of suppliers in a supply chain. Then on the leverage side, some of the variables that we look at to estimate the level of influence or that a company would have over its suppliers include sourcing spend, the spend trends. A supplier is going to be more cooperative perhaps if they are seeing a good future in the business with their buyer. Whereas if that's on a downward trend, maybe not so much. The duration of the relationship, the nature of the relationship. So there are a number of factors there. And these are not, it's going to vary by company. Every company has a unique supply chain and needs to use this framework to develop a model that makes the most sense for them. But through this, this segmentation approach, companies can optimize the subsequent program that they design, can fit it to the right types of, they can fit it appropriately to the suppliers within their supply chain. And again, if we could go to the next slide, please. Segmentation is, it's not, as I said, it's not a one size fits all approach. It's not meant to be the same between a company and their competitors or peers. And it's not meant to be a one-off exercise. What it is, it's a framework. It uses these concepts of risk exposure and risk leverage. It's quite customizable, and it's about insights into risk management and design, and about optimizing the subsequent program. Now, if we'll go to the next slide, Ding Ding. Then once that segmentation has been done and a company better understands their supply chain and how they want to prioritize their approach, we take a full business workflow illustrates our kind of full cycle of engagement to manage and conduct due diligence in a supply chain from an ESG perspective. And while you could start almost anywhere in this cycle, I'll start with supplier onboarding, but that's where it begins, ensuring that new suppliers are profiled appropriately, that they align their codes of conduct with the company, that they've been trained to have the right mindset for engaging with a company that has higher ESG expectations. And we offer a number of tools and solutions that facilitate that. Then comes the risk assessment. So a more rigorous determination of the level of risk of suppliers within a supply chain. And this is not a one-off exercise, because these are things that change over time. And again, we offer a number of solutions related to that. Then self-assessment questionnaires or audits can provide deeper data, deeper understanding, including on-the-ground insights of sites and suppliers. If necessary, investigations can be conducted when we're monitoring suppliers. Those could be as simple as spot checks or very deep investigations. If there have been significant allegations or incidents, then it could call for a much more intensive investigation. And sometimes those investigations then lead to the need for intensive responses. And once again, our suite of tools supports these interventions. And finally, we can't forget remediation. Once these gaps have been identified, or when issues have been identified, then how do we improve? How do we build up responsible sourcing programs? How do we support suppliers themselves to build up their own capacity to meet the requirements of buyers and others? And we have a number of approaches to that. All of this feeds back into some of the transparency and reporting and communications of companies. So the impact evaluation, they can see what the effects of these programs and activities are, as well as how they stack up against their peers. Reporting and disclosure is not only about meeting the requirements of regulators, but can also, it's an opportunity to be a leader and to show to customers and to others both the good work that companies are doing, but also to be honest about the challenges that all companies should be facing. And then this feeds back into the management cycle again. So it's a cycle of continuous improvement and innovation. If you go to the next slide, Ding Ding, behind all of this, and what's a real strength of our team, and a tool that is so valuable for us and for our clients, is EIQ.ai. And this is a data platform that pulls together data from 40,000 plus days per year on sites in over 110 countries and regions. So we have a large team of assessors who are on the ground every day in factories, on site at production facilities, and in agricultural environments, who are very close to the workers and generating great data on the ESG performance across supply chains. And all of that data, which again it's on the ground data, is fed back into the system, which provides a very quantitative and global view. And earlier we saw some of the insights that are enabled by this system when Ding Ding was taking us through the trends and some of what we're seeing around the world. But this system is a cornerstone of our solutions, and has we probably could have spent the hour just playing around with it and showing you all what its features include. If you would go to the next slide, please, Ding Ding. All of these subsequent steps inform the design of management systems for supply chain sustainability. Now, there is no one size fits all. These are they are fit to they're tailored to each company. But here we can see that there are a number of categories in which there are processes or existing solutions varying from pretty simple things that are low intensity up to very high intensity engagements that can be more involved. And it ranges from policies. And so many companies don't even have basic policies on how to responsibly source. And those are easy to establish, but then how do we convert the written policies into actions and behaviors? And that could include being part of industry initiatives, which can influence policies beyond just the company itself. Assessments, of course, are just an integral part of good supply chain management, knowing what's happening on the ground in supply chains. And in addition to risk assessments or commodity level analysis, this can get much more intensive into supply chain mapping and traceability or highly specialized audits. Then on the management side, it ranges from e-learning, which we have an e-learning solutions as well, EIQ Learn, and that provides a great scalable way to educate larger numbers, larger audiences, or in cases where more intensive engagement is needed, in-factory consulting and coaching can be provided. For tracking and reporting, it is important, as was said in the previous segment. You make what you measure, or you manage what you measure, and so having great tracking and reporting is important, and that can range from kind of a global level risk analysis, simpler forms of worker surveys, to far more sophisticated worker engagement platforms, which are two-way and become more of a conversation for companies and workers to have constructive engagement. And then with remediation, as the problems are always going to occur. There's no perfect solution that ensures that there will never be sustainability problems in supply chains. So being prepared for when those problems do occur, having grievance mechanisms so that when incidents do occur, when workers file grievances, they can be effectively resolved to the satisfaction of the workers. Conducting root cause analysis to really get to not just addressing symptoms, but engineering out the problems from the very root. Community engagement, because so many of these problems they're not just beyond the four walls of the company or beyond the supply chain. They include the entire community around them as well. And so all of these different steps, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just doing one here and one here, or one there. But approaching these as a full program design is really necessary to get to meet the standards and the expectations that are increasingly the norm. With that, I'll hand it back over to Kevin, and we can kind of recap a lot of what we've covered. I know it's been a lot of content, and move towards the end of this session. Kevin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Perhaps just before we close, I recognize we only have a few minutes left. There are a couple of questions that have come in. I think the first one is for Ding Ding, and then Jeff, there's also one for you. It's good that we stay on this slide whilst we reflect on these. So Ding Ding, the question for you that's come in is around kind of key risks and trends. You mentioned a couple of the kind of big migration patterns ongoing at the moment, Bangladesh workers in Malaysia and other countries. You also obviously mentioned Ukraine as a kind of risk area from a migration perspective. Are there any other hotspots, country or migration corridors that people on the phone should be aware of?
There are a number. I'll just maybe give a couple of examples. One is in Asia. There are a number of receiving countries in the same category as Malaysia. For instance, Taiwan, Thailand, Japan, South Korea. Each one of them, use workers from other countries, typically, Indonesia, Philippines, and also Hong Kong, to be frank, also use a lot of workers from Indonesia and Philippines. So that's one corridor in Asia, from those countries to relatively more developed countries to work in both supply chain as well as other domestic worker markets. In Europe, we also see, similarly, Asian workers may move over to European countries. We see Nepalese workers in Europe as well. So that's another corridor. The third one in Americas, Mexican workers or South American workers in the US. That's a common one. We see a lot of them work in agriculture farms to, for instance, for berry picking, etc. So that's quite an obvious one. Yeah, maybe anything. Did I miss any?
No, that sounds great. And I just want to remind everyone on the phone and dialing in, there's nothing wrong with migrant workers. In fact, many of us on the call are migrant workers. And migrant workers are a critical part of the global economy. However, the reason why we're flagging it is because they are a leading indicator of a number of other potential risks. So where there are migrant workers, we need to be careful and extra cautious around topics like wages, working hours, passport retention, freedom of movement, etc., all of which Ding Ding covered previously. So migrant workers are an expected part of any economy, and we should be designing programs to reflect that and to identify those risks where they exist in supply chains. Which actually brings on to the second question, which is one for Jeff, who has a lot of experience in this historically. And looking at this slide is particularly appropriate because there's a lot of stuff on this slide. So the second question is, aren't you making it too complicated? Could this be done in a more simple way? Jeff, over to you.
Well, I'm all ears for simpler approaches to it. I think that this is getting into many of the details of what we could view as a relatively simple framework. Some of the principles that we start with are quite simple. But then once we get into the implementation, we find that there are lots of complexities here that call for the more specific approaches. And for some suppliers, for some situations, a very simple approach works. That's why the segmentation is one of the first steps in these exercises. But then some of the problems are just so complex that even all of these things may not solve some of them. They are extremely complex problems. For example, some of the labor migration issues that involve not only cultural behaviors at the level of communities of origin and local economies, but international trade, bilateral agreements, labor regulations in destination countries, business practices in those destination countries, trade volatility. It quickly becomes a highly complex problem that, at least in many cases, I don't know if I've yet to see just a simple silver bullet solution. But if someone does have ideas, I'm all ears.
Yeah, fully agreed, Jeff, and thank you for that. That's a great answer. And also fully agreed, these are complex issues, and sometimes we need to have a number of tools in the toolkit in order to be able to address them systematically and in a structured way. Just a quick reminder before we hand back over to the incredible GlobeScan team. Ultimately, what we flagged today are, firstly, some of those key risks and issues that are manifesting in supply chains globally. We've spoken about some of the regulatory regime that is driving more accountability into the business agenda day to day across all regions. And we've spoken a lot about particularly the social risks on the labor and health and safety side, with a key focus on migrant workers and risks linked to migrant workers relating to forced labor and human rights in particular. All of this, I think, is particularly compounded and will continue to be compounded by ongoing COVID-19 issues and risks, trade tensions, particularly between a few key countries. And this means that businesses need to have programs that are fit for purpose, designed to be responsive, fast, and rapidly moving to both identify and manage those risks in a proactive way. Only by doing that proactively will we, A, be able to ensure continued resilience in supply chains, B, be able to ensure that shipments that businesses have planned, that they have intended to get into the market and to consumers, arrive on time and on budget, and C, that we as a team, as an organization, and as a collective of everyone on this call and our industry globally are collectively mobilized to address sustainability and to drive sustainability into supply chains and across the business agenda, ultimately achieving our end goals of better people and planet. So with that, I hand us back over to the GlobeScan team, who will take us on to the next session. And thank you again for having Elevate as part of this important agenda.